F1 will change soon. A new set of regulations for the engine and the chassis is set to transform the sport in 2026. However, in the last few months, some rumours started to come up, because Stefano Domenicali, the boss of F1, and Mohammed bin Sulayem, the boss of the FIA, both said that they could think about bringing back V10 engines to F1. This is a complete shocker. Not only would F1 move away from its current plan for hybrid engines with more electrical power, they would even go back into the early 2000s. But why does this all come up now? And why do we talk about this before we've even driven a kilometer in the 2026 cars? This is what we're going to talk about in this video. And in order to understand where these ideas come from, we first have to take a closer look at the 2026 cars. Because as I already said, 2026 is the year in which F1 is set to change drastically. We will see slimmer and lighter cars with things like active aerodynamics combined with a new engine. It will replace the old engine regulations we have since 2014 when the current V6 was introduced. And after more than 10 years, the sport wanted to electrify them even more with engines for the future and for the manufacturers. And this meant one thing: the batteries had to become more powerful. But what does that exactly mean? Well, the mechanical part of the engine will pretty much stay the same. However, the MGUK, the part of the engine that generates the power from the brakes, will increase its power from 120 kW to 350 kW in 2026. They are also going to decrease the fuel flow of the engine by 25%, which will make it weaker. The problem is now that the battery will keep its maximum capacity at the current 4 MJ, because if you now divide the 4 MJ capacity by the new 350 kilowatts of power from the MGUK in 2026, you will only get around 11 seconds per lap in which you can fully use the battery. And even though you are allowed to recharge the battery multiple times during the lap, you can only get a maximum of 8.5 MJ per lap, which will only give you around 24 seconds per lap in which you can fully use the power of the engine. This would decrease the power of the engines for 2026 massively, because the distribution between engine and battery is going to be changed from 85% engine and 15% battery, which we currently have, to 55% engine and 45% battery in 2026. This is also the reason why the FIA wrote the engine regulations before the chassis regulations, because they now had to make the chassis more efficient in order to compensate the performance loss from the engine. That is why we see things like active aerodynamics with different modes for the car, all to just not make the 2026 cars too slow. And one team that warned about such potential problems pretty early on was Red Bull. But everybody just thought that they would say something like this because they joined F1 in 2026 as a new engine manufacturer with Red Bull powertrains and Ford. But now it really seems like F1 and the FIA have gotten themselves into a pretty big problem for which they now have to find a solution. This is a pretty rough and short summary of a topic that is far too complex to describe in only one video, but we have to know what has happened in the background up until this point in order to understand these public statements, because that is where the idea about the V10 engines with synthetic fuels comes into play. But maybe let's see why they might be such a good idea. And let's start with the most obvious but also the most striking effect. The engines, and with that the cars, will get a lot lighter. This would have positive effects on multiple factors. Lighter cars would make it more comfortable for the drivers to drive the car. Safety structure of the circuits would change because a heavier car needs higher safety standards because it has more kinetic energy that would need to be absorbed by the safety layout of the track. Such a car would also make it possible to use the tires in a different way, having to deal with less overheating, and also, very important, a V10 engine is far less complex and therefore cheaper to build. This could be the decisive factor for potential manufacturers like Toyota to come back into F1, but also the current F1 teams will profit from a cheaper engine, because they could easier finance their engagement in the sport. But I think the most important factor for us fans would be to get back this beautiful sound from a V10 engine in an F1 car. Some of the older fans have been lucky enough to hear them once live, but the younger generations would still probably be very happy to hear this sound themselves on a racetrack. And the comeback of the V10 engines would also make F1 less reliant on car manufacturers. Right now F1 needs these big car manufacturers because they are the only ones that can afford such expensive engines. But they just don't do this because they love Formula 1 so much. They want to get something back in return, which is some technology transfer for their road cars. They won't be too happy to see F1 bring back old classical engines, because they still want to keep up the belief that F1 still produces parts for the road cars, which is not true. I mean, the current engines are so complex and expensive that manufacturers like Mercedes will probably never even implement one part of their engines from F1 into road legal cars, because it just wouldn't be possible. And you have to keep in mind that the road cars out there have changed over the last few years. While it seemed like we would transfer into very electrical cars in the next few years in 2019, after the pandemic, it turned out that more hybrids are now asked, because, well, the electrical revolution is just not coming yet. It will be, but not yet. However, even most of the big manufacturers in F1 would still love to see an alternative for the 2026 engines. But why do I say most of them and not all? Well, that is because especially the newcomers, Audi and Cadillac, only joined F1 in the first place because they believed that they would race with hybrid engines. So what does this mean for Audi and Cadillac? Well, because Audi seems to be the bigger problem, I would like to start with Cadillac, because they seem to be okay with an engine regulation change, but not for 2026 or the near future. Not because of the engine, but because of the car. Because if F1 would stick to its 2025 regulations for 2026, the team wouldn't have a car that they could drive with. Same holds for Audi, but they would have a general problem with such a change, because they only joined F1 under the condition that they would race with engines with higher hybrid power. If now F1 decides to go back to V10 engines, the team will be punished heavily for preparing a car for 2026. The company has spent millions of euros over years to prepare for this project, and has quit most of its motorsport activities just to join F1. And if now all of a sudden they couldn't take part in 2026 because F1 changed its direction, well, that would be a huge kick in the teeth for them, and it would throw them completely off track. But even if F1 only changed to V10 engines after the next engine regulation change in 2031, would Audi still stay in F1? I mean, they have joined F1 under this condition that they would race with a high percentage of hybrid power in the engines. Why wouldn't they like to spend their money on a project that would be more suited to them? Honestly, I can't really answer this question, and probably Audi can't neither. But I can say one thing for sure. It seems like there is a change necessary. We can't avoid it. And apparently I'm not the only one, because most of the people in the paddock are not convinced by the 2026 engines, and some of them even think about quitting them before the next engine regulation change, which is in 2031. But if a change in the plan seems to be inevitable, when are we going to do this then? Well, before we talk about that, we have to understand one thing. In order to make such a huge change of the regulations, especially in such a short time, we need a so-called supermajority. That means that F1, the FIA, and most of the teams and the manufacturers need to vote for such a change. However, it seems like the FIA doesn't want to give anyone an unfair disadvantage, especially not the newcomers Audi and Cadillac. So in a nutshell, if Audi or Cadillac don't agree with the new regulation changes, the FIA won't either. Just keep that in mind when we talk about possible scenarios now. But what will be the possible or not so possible scenarios? Well, I think F1 has three options, and I would like to start with the most unlikely one. A switch to V10 engines with synthetic fuels in 2026. This is the most unlikely one, as it will cause multiple problems that would have to be solved in a few months' time. As we know, Audi and Cadillac couldn't take part because they only have cars for the 2026 regulations. But even most of the current F1 teams would have problems in such a scenario. For example, Red Bull is set to swap to its own engines in 2026 from Red Bull powertrains and Ford. What are they going to do? Are they going to continue to use Honda's engines? But they are set to supply Aston Martin in 2026. Or what about Alpine? They are set to take Mercedes engines for 2026 because they don't have an engine development program themselves anymore. It's just too late for such a wild move. They have to keep the 2026 regulations, not only because of a lack of time, but also because everyone has spent way too much money on these plans. It would be crazy to throw all of this away before we've even driven a kilometer. So we have to stick with it. But maybe not until 2031. That would be the less radical version. Use the new regulations until 2027 or 2028 and then switch to the V10s. This will give everybody, even the new teams, time to develop a new car, and it would also take less time because the new engines are less complex. But I'm not quite sure that everybody will go along with that. As we already said, Audi doesn't really like the idea of not using hybrid engines, but maybe also other manufacturers wouldn't also agree with that and leave F1. Nonetheless, this scenario seems way more likely than the first one. The teams are given enough time to build new cars and engines, we would still use the 2026 regulations, and most importantly, the new teams wouldn't be penalized because they only joined in 2026. But to be honest, it is most likely that they're going to try out to work with the 2026 regulations, even if they aren't really attractive. And in defense of the new regulations, we haven't even driven a single kilometer with them, and people are already starting to complain. Maybe we should give it a try and see that they are not as bad as we all thought before. Plus, there are ways to improve the power of the engine with adjustments to things like the fuel flow. Of course, this would also mean that they would be less efficient, but it is one of the only factors that we can change in order to improve the power of the engines. We also have to keep in mind that a panic move right now might turn out even worse later. But to be honest, it would be good for F1 to have an engine that is less complex and expensive, especially for the teams, because they could finance the sport easier even if the times might not be the best. I mean, F1 has already experienced such a small collapse in 2009, when most of the manufacturers left the sport because of the global economical crisis. However, one thing about this current debate is bothering me, because it is totally fine to talk about a switch to other engines in a few years' time, like Domenicali and Ben Sulayem did. However, what is not okay is to panic and start thinking about a switch back to V10 engines already in 2026, because this would make manufacturers and teams freak out, and I can understand them. They've invested a lot of time and money into these programs, only to then be left hanging because some people are freaking out that these engines might be too weak. It almost seems like the opinion of these manufacturers and teams isn't really important. However, F1 and the FIA need to make some changes to these engines, but in what way and at what time can only be told in the future. So give the 2026 regulations a little bit of time and a chance, and maybe they might turn out not as bad as we all think right now. But what do you think about the 2026 engine regulations? Do you think we have to change something right now, or only in a few years' time, or maybe not something at all? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you for watching, feel free to subscribe, and until then, I'll see you next time.